Hello and welcome to our next video. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the views that line up with the controller. So I'm going to go ahead and close down this controller file that we had open last time. And what I want to do is take a look at the views on the contacts. Now this is going to give me the chance to be able to look at the code in a little more detail. So here's my index for my contacts. So when I go to my contacts page, I would see this index and it would basically render my view. You can see what it does is it gives us a list of contacts, which is our model. So contactweb.models.contact as a base object to be stored and used on the view. And so it knows it's expecting a list or some other enumerable of contacts to be able to work with. And then it uses a little bit of Razor code here, and it basically says this is an index, that's a little HTML, and we can set the title to anything we want. And here we have an action link to create a new. And when we do that, it's going to click on this. We'll be able to create, and it'll take us to the create view. And that's going to be that create get request. It's going to then render a table, and ultimately that's going to have user ID, first name, last name, email, phone, birthday, street address, city, state, and zip. And notice saying model and then rocket model zip. So basically, this is the Lambda syntax in C# that allows us to find the object and then get the object property right there. So for the model on the page that we're currently on, or whatever we're looking at, the model itself here, these are just properties, so model.zip is universal to all of them. And then what we'll do is then for each item in the model that's on the page, which is going to be our list or our enumerable of contacts, then it knows for each one of those, take the item and get its specific property, username, first name, etc. And so this listing operation is going to display every single property right on the page in just a normal table cell. And then on the very far right column will be a column that says, if you'd like to edit, click here. If you'd like to get the details on this specific object, click here. If you'd like to delete it, click here. And note that each single one of those uses the ID to pass in to that specific property of editing, details, or delete. Each one of those requested that we pass in an ID on the controller. If we take a quick look at that, we can see that. So on our controller, on our contacts controller, again, we see that details requires an ID, creating, of course, requires the entire object, edit requires an ID, and delete requires an ID. And that's what this is doing on the index view. It's basically saying, pass in the item ID when you click on this and go to the edit get request, details get request, or delete get request. So all of that is also wired up for us. We have links on our page and we'll be rendering every single contact that's in the database. So that's really awesome. And we can take a look at these other ones as well. So of course, if we want to see the details, this is just going to get a single contact as its model, not a list or not an enumerable. And the title of the page is details, and it's basically just an H2 header up there to show us what page we're on. And then this is the contact, and then it displays stuff. And again, we're going to display every property on that model. So the specific one that's on the page there now is going to show us, you know, whatever that model's properties are. It also allows us to edit or go back to the list. It takes us back to index or goes to edit, passing in the ID. Editing is going to be very similar, except it's going to let us actually edit. So here it's going to put some validation on the page for us, and then it's going to store the ID in what's called a hidden field. So if you're familiar with HTML, obviously a hidden field just makes it so that it's on the page and accessible by code or by whatever needs to get access to that object property, but it doesn't show up to the user. So we're actually going to use this a little bit later too, because we're going to hide the user ID. There's no reason to show that, and we really don't want people to know that. And we'll do that in a later video when we clean things up, but just get ready for that. And so then we see here is this editor for as well, which is going to use this user ID property, and we have editor for the first name, editor for. Now what that means is it's going to give us a text box that will put the property in there as it is, and we can change it and hit save, and it will know that this is supposed to happen. And note that every single one of these is also wired up with a validation message. If you have a blank field right now for any of those, it's basically going to say that's not really valid. You know, that's an error. So we don't want to do that. We could add more validation messages and basically make sure that this is a date, an actual date time if we wanted to, things like that. So You can see that there's some validation on the editing, which is important. You don't want to maybe leave those blank. Maybe you do. So you would be able to give it a blank zip code for some reason. So creating is going to be very similar as well. Creating allows us to do essentially editing on a brand new object. So these are going to be blank at this point. And then, of course, it'll just do the saving at the bottom as well. And allows us to also go back to our list here. So we've looked at create, edit. Delete's going to be similar to details as well. First, we'll ask us if we're sure we want to do this. And, basically, if we don't, we should stop. But it will just display the properties. You're not editing here. And really, the only thing that matters on a delete is the ID. So we'll allow you to delete. And if you hit say I want to delete, it will delete it. It will then pass that as a post and pass in the ID by default. And so I think that wraps up our look at every view. We've looked at the listing, the editing, the creating, the details, and the delete. So you can see that all these views are wired up, but they're going to be pretty plain Jane. Let's go ahead and run it. Let's hit F5 and run it and see what this looks like. And obviously we don't have any data in our context right now, so there won't be anything to do. And don't try to add any yet because we're not quite ready. But let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. And so while this is loading, does anyone want to take a guess why we can't do this yet? And if you thought about it, it's because we haven't wired up the user ID. And so if we try to do anything with a user ID that we haven't had it wired up, we couldn't do it. And we'll also see here, notice that this says bad request. And you might think, what? What did I do wrong? Well, what we did wrong was we tried to load a details request without an ID. Not only do we not have any context in the system, but because I was on the details view when I hit F5, it tried to load this up and it doesn't work. Now I could try to put in a detail ID there, but this is going to return that not found. And so that was what we were expecting for that as well. And as long as we're doing this, I might as well show you, you can put breakpoints on these in your controller if you want to do some debugging on your coding. So we're looking at details here, so I'll find my details. And what I'm going to do is put a breakpoint right here. And then I'm going to put a breakpoint here and a breakpoint here. Now I'm going to rerun this request just by hitting enter here. And what we'll see is that it brings me into my code and allows me to see what's happening. So my ID was 4. Well, why didn't it find anything? Well, of course, we don't have any data. So that's exactly what it should have done. And we're going to go ahead and I was hitting F5 there to go to the next breakpoint. And this is where we're at. So right now we can't do details. We can't do editing. We can't do create. We can list our context though. Now notice what it did was it just basically took our root of our solution and put in context, which is the name of that controller without the word controller. So if I put home, what do you think is going to happen? And there you go. It brings up the home page. So I'm basically just whatever controller I want to use. Oops, I can't spell account. I can type that in, and that doesn't like that because maybe the accounts controller doesn't work the way I think it did. But I know that contacts does. So there's my contacts homepage. This should take me to index. Index will be the default if you don't specify a specific view. And so we see it is on index, and it says I can create new here, and it lists out all the contacts we have, which is 0. If I try to create new, it'll let me go to the page, but I don't know what my user ID is here, and maybe I could get one in there by putting something in, but it won't link up to my account. And well, yeah, so maybe try that and see what happens. I'm pretty sure it would just, if it saves it, if this isn't a reference specifically, it will let you do that. But if you have this wired up as it needs to be a foreign key in your database, then it wouldn't let you. But that wraps up our look at the views. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.